Northern Texas, late autumn of 1874. The night hung heavy with the smell of dry earth and sagebrush, the sky a smear of violet fading into black. Somewhere out there, coyotes yipped, quick, sharp cries that carried far in the stillness, but they were swallowed by the sound that mattered most, pounding hooves. Clara Hayes leaned low over the neck of her worn, bony mule, whispering through clenched teeth, "Come on, Daisy." Just a little farther. The mule's flanks were slick with sweat, and her breath came in short, hard bursts. Clara felt every jolt of the rutted road shoot up through the wooden bench of the small wagon she'd taken, stolen, if you wanted to be particular about the law, though she doubted anyone chasing her was concerned about justice. Behind her, the shouts of Boone Kessler's men rose and fell, the voices rough and mean, riding the wind like barbed wire slicing through the dark. The wagon wasn't built for speed, especially not over this kind of ground. Every wheel that slammed into a rut made the boards groan. One more good jolt, and she'd lose an axle, and then they'd have her. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Shapes emerged out of the moonlight. 3 riders, their hats pulled low, their bodies crouched forward in the saddles. The flash of a rifle barrel caught her, just before a single gunshot split the night. The sound was deafening. The bullet sang past her right ear, close enough that she felt its heat, and then it sliced through the brim of her hat. A neat little hole the size of a nickel appeared above her brow, and the smell of burnt felt hit her nose. Her grip on the reins tightened. Daisy stumbled, recovered, then lurched forward again as Clara slapped the reins harder. Her teeth rattled, her spine jarred, but she didn't care. If they caught her, she knew what waited. Silas Marlowe's voice was still burned into her mind, low, precise, always with the faintest edge of mockery. "If you ever try to run, girl, I'll see to it you're dragged back by your hair, and you'll wish you were dead before I'm done with you." A darker shape appeared ahead in the road, a felled mesquite tree, its gnarled branches jutting out like a warning. The road forked left around it, but the left path dropped into a shallow wash. The right was tighter, with a slope and loose gravel. Neither was good. She steered Daisy right, pulling hard. The wagon skidded, the rear wheels tossing up a spray of rocks. The mule's hooves clattered dangerously close to slipping, but the animal kept her feet under her, stubborn as ever. The men behind her shouted again. One was close enough now she could hear the creak of leather and the rattle of his spurs. The moon slid behind a bank of clouds, throwing the land into shadow. Clara's heart pounded so loud it drowned out the mule's hooves for a moment. She could smell dust in the air, taste it on her tongue. Asterisk, don't think. Just move. Asterisk. Her hands ached from gripping the reins. Her dress was damp with sweat down her back. The hem was already shredded from earlier, when she'd vaulted over a fence in the dark to steal the wagon. Boone's voice boomed from the dark. "You make it harder, girl. It's only worse for you." She didn't answer. She bent lower, urging Daisy with a whisper, then with a sharp flick of the reins. The wagon jolted violently as a front wheel slammed into a hidden rock. The jolt threw her forward, and for one heart-stopping second she thought she was going to pitch right out onto the road. She clung to the seat, biting back a cry. Another shot rang out. This one hit wood. A splinter flew up from the wagon's sideboard and cut a shallow line across her cheek. The sting of it made her eyes water. Her mule's ears flicked back, panicked, but the animal didn't slow. In the distance, maybe a quarter mile ahead, Clara caught sight of something, a low ridge of darker shadow that might be a bluff or a cluster of scrub and mesquite. It wasn't much, but it was cover. If she could just reach it before the moon came out again. A crow screamed somewhere to her right, its cry hoarse and ragged. She bent low over Daisy's neck, murmuring, "Come on, girl, just a little more." The sound of pursuit wavered behind her, Boone shouting orders, the thud of hooves, the jingle of bridles. They were close, but she still had a sliver of lead. The ridge was coming up fast. She could see the shapes of rock now, black against the horizon. Her heart slammed hard once more, a final push of fear and determination, and then she yanked the reins left, steering off the road into the scrub. Branches slapped at her arms, tearing the sleeve of her dress, but she didn't slow until the wagon rolled into the shallow gully beyond. The mule heaved, blowing out great clouds of breath in the cold night air. Clara slid from the seat, landing hard, and scrambled up the side of the gully to peer over. The riders tore past on the road above, their shouts fading into the distance. Boone himself was among them, his broad-shouldered frame unmistakable, his hat low and his rifle ready. She didn't breathe until they were gone. Even then, she didn't trust the quiet. Somewhere out there, Silas Marlowe's men still hunted her, and they would keep hunting until they had her back in chains. Before the night of the chase, before the dust and the gunshots, Clara Hayes had been little more than a shadow in someone else's house. She was born in Kansas, the youngest of 4 children, to a farming family that seemed cursed with poor soil and worse luck. Her mother died when Clara was 10, leaving her father adrift and her brothers restless. By the time she was 16, her father had been buried on the far edge of their land, and her brothers had scattered, one to a logging camp in Missouri, one to railroad work, one simply gone. The only relative left to her was her mother's brother, Andrew Lyle. He was a man of sour temper and narrow eyes, who considered charity a kind of personal insult. When Clara arrived at his boarding house in Denver with a single suitcase, he made her earn her keep in the kitchen from the first morning. She scrubbed floors, peeled potatoes until her hands were raw, and learned quickly how to keep out of the way when Andrew's voice got sharp. At first, she thought the arrangement might last. It was work, but it was shelter. Then, one evening in late winter, Andrew came into the kitchen with a folded sheet of paper and a smile that chilled her blood. "Girl," he said, "I've found you a place." The place was with Silas Marlowe, hotel and mine owner in Colorado Springs, twice her age, with a reputation for both wealth and temper. Andrew had acquired gambling debts with a speed that astonished her. He explained, in the slow, deliberate tone a man uses when pretending to be reasonable, that Silas had agreed to forgive those debts in exchange for a future wife. It wasn't legal marriage, not at first. It was an arrangement, a promise, a purchase, if anyone was honest. Clara was 19. The Marlowe house was built like a fortress, 3 stories of stone and brick on a hill that overlooked the town. Inside, everything was polished heavy and cold. Velvet drapes, brass sconces, the ticking of clocks that always seemed too loud. Servants moved like ghosts through the hallways, avoiding Silas's gaze. Silas himself was a tall, spare man with hair just beginning to silver at the temples. He had pale eyes, the kind that looked right through you, and a mouth that rarely smiled without a sneer at the edge. In company, he could be charming. In private, he was not. The first month, he treated Clara as one might a new horse, evaluating her gait, her manners, her silences. He told her how to stand, how to walk, what to say and what not to say. He had opinions about the way she braided her hair. He did not tolerate questions. She learned quickly that any small defiance would be met with a cold, deliberate sort of punishment. Dinners canceled, outings forbidden, letters from her brothers intercepted and burned in the fireplace. Sometimes punishment came in the form of nothing at all, days where she was simply ignored, left to sit in her room, listening to the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. After 6 months, she understood that she was not meant to be a wife so much as possession. Silas liked to have her on his arm at the theater, at the tables in the hotel dining room, walking through the lobby of his establishments. He liked the way people looked at her, the way other men glanced twice before realizing whose company she kept. Once, in late summer, she overheard a conversation between Silas and a mine foreman. She had been coming down the back stairwell when she heard her name. "Pretty thing," the foreman said. "She'll do," Silas replied. "And she'll stay. There's nowhere for her to go. I've made certain of that." That was when Clara began thinking of leaving. It took nearly a year for her to find a chance. Silas kept his house locked, his staff watchful. She had no money of her own. Andrew had taken the last of her father's coin when she came west. But she had 2 gold earrings, her mother's, tucked into the lining of her sewing bag. The opportunity came in early spring. Silas had left for a meeting in Pueblo, taking his carriage and driver with him. Only a skeleton staff remained in the house. Clara waited until the kitchen boy, Matthew, was alone in the scullery, washing dishes. He was no older than 14, wiry and sharp-eyed. She pressed the earrings into his palm and told him she needed a wagon to the edge of town before dawn. Matthew hesitated, long enough for her to think he might refuse, then nodded. At 3 in the morning, she slipped out the side door with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle of bread and cheese. Matthew was waiting with an old mule hitched to a wagon barely fit for hauling hay. "Don't take the main road," he whispered. "Go south, past the river. Folks there won't ask questions." She climbed up onto the seat, murmured her thanks, and took the reins. For the first 2 days, she kept the back trails, sleeping under the wagon at night, eating sparingly. She skirted towns, buying what little she needed from roadside vendors with coins Matthew had slipped into her hand. But on the morning of the 3rd day, she saw them, 3 riders far off, coming fast along the ridge. Boone Kessler's men. She recognized Boone from a mining banquet, a man with a black beard and a smile that never reached his eyes. He worked for Silas. From that moment, it was a race. She abandoned the slow trails and took the main road south into Texas, hoping to lose him in the wide, sprawled land. But by nightfall, they had closed the distance. That night became the chase, the rattling wagon, the pounding hooves, the gunshot that tore through her hat. And now, hiding in the scrub, her breath harsh in her ears, she knew she could never go back. Silas Marlowe would not forgive a runaway, and Boone Kessler never lost a trail. The sun was a pale coin, just breaking the horizon, when Clara dared to move again. She had spent the last hours crouched in the shallow gully, the smell of mule sweat and dry weeds clinging to her. Daisy stood tethered to a scraggly mesquite, sides heaving, eyes half lidded with exhaustion. Clara's own legs felt like wood when she straightened. Her neck ached from sleeping in fits, every sound jerking her awake. A distant owl, the rustle of grass, the creak of wagon wood cooling in the night air. She had to keep moving. Boone's men had ridden past, but that didn't mean they'd given up. If they'd lost their trail in the dark, they'd pick it up in daylight. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat, wincing as the boards groaned. She pulled Daisy into a slow trot along the gully floor until it widened enough for them to climb out. The sky was brightening fast, the stars fading. The land rolled away in all directions, pale grass, clumps of sage, the occasional dark shape of a windmill or half-collapsed barn. The road she found was little more than 2 ruts in the dirt, but it pointed east, and east was away from Boone. By the time the sun was fully up, the air was already warming. The mule plodded on head low, and Clara's own eyes felt grainy with fatigue. Her thoughts drifted to water, to sleep, to the bread she had left, when something caught her ear, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the mule's hooves. She pulled back on the reins, listening. At first, she thought it was the creak of old wood. Then she realized it was crying, faint, muffled, and close. Clara scanned the land. The road bent ahead toward an old windmill, its blade still, the tower tilting slightly. Half the slats in the water tank below were missing, and weeds choked the ground around it. She dismounted and tied Daisy to a fence post that leaned more than it stood. Her boots crunched over dry grass as she approached the structure. The crying grew clearer, small, uneven sobs, the kind that come when a person's too tired to wail anymore. "Hello." Clara's voice came out softer than she intended. The sob stopped. Silence, except for a faint rustle inside the shadow beneath the windmill. Clara knelt and peered into the gloom. The space was half filled with splintered boards and wind-blown grass. And there, huddled in the far corner, was a child. A girl, maybe 10 years old. Her dress was torn, the hem ragged. A single braid hung over her shoulder, tied with a bit of fraying blue ribbon. Her bare feet were dusty, toes curled against the cold earth. Big brown eyes fixed on Clara, not wide with fear, but watchful. "You came," the girl said simply. Clara blinked. "Came." The girl nodded. "I've been waiting for my sister." The words knocked the breath from Clara in an odd way. She'd never had a sister. Never had anyone call her that. "I'm not," she began, but stopped. The child's face was drawn, her lips pale. Hunger and exhaustion were etched there in a way Clara recognized from her own reflection in hard times. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Annie Mae." Clara glanced around. No horse. No pack. No sign of anyone else. Where's your family? Annie's gaze dropped. Papa went to town. Said he'd be back before supper, but that was 3 days ago. 3 days. Out here, alone. No wonder the girl's voice was rough from crying. Clara hesitated. She didn't have time for this. Every minute she lingered was a minute Boone could close the gap. She needed to head east, keep moving, keep vanishing. But Annie's small fingers were twisted in the hem of her dress, and Clara knew that if she turned away, the girl would stay there until someone else found her. And she doubted that someone would be kind. You got water? Clara asked. Annie shook her head. Food. Another shake. Clara sighed. All right, come on. Annie hesitated just long enough to study Clara's face, as if measuring whether the stranger could be trusted. Then she crawled out from under the windmill, moving stiffly, and took Clara's offered hand. Her palm was small, warm, and dry. Too dry. Clara led her back to the wagon and helped her climb up onto the seat. She broke off a piece of bread from her bundle and handed it over. Annie took it with both hands, nibbling like a wary sparrow. Where do you live? Clara asked as they started forward again. Papa's place, Annie said between bites. Near the river bend. There's a big pecan tree out front. You can see it from the road. The girl's voice carried a note of pride, faint but clear. Clara followed her directions, guiding Daisy along the dirt track that veered south. The miles passed slow. Annie ate the rest of the bread, and then leaned against Clara's arm, her small body warm in the cool morning air. Clara kept one hand on the reins and one eye on the horizon. A mile before they reached the river bend, Daisy's ears pricked forward. A rattling hiss cut the stillness. Clara spotted the snake coiled in the road, mottled brown and tan, its tail buzzing in warning. She pulled Daisy up short and scanned the wagon bed. A long, dusty shape leaned against the side, an old double-barreled shotgun. She checked the chambers, loaded, then aimed. One blast echoed across the empty land, and the rattlesnake went still. Annie flinched at the sound but didn't cry. You shot it, the girl said, all creeping into her voice. Couldn't let it spook the mule, Clara replied, lowering the gun. They reached the farm just as the sun cleared the treetops. It was a tired place, a small house with peeling paint, a barn leaning like an old man, a few cows and a fenced pasture. Annie pointed. That's home. A man stepped out onto the porch as they pulled up, broad-shouldered, sunburned, with a kind of tired look that spoke of too many early mornings and too little rest. His eyes went first to Annie and lit up. Annie Mae! He crossed the yard in 3 long strides, scooping her up into his arms. She laughed, the sound lighter than anything Clara had heard from her yet. The man's gaze shifted to Clara, wary now. Found her under a windmill, Clara said, keeping her voice even. She said you've been gone 3 days. The man's jaw tightened. Got held up in town. Trouble with the cattle buyers. He looked back at Annie, then to Clara. Name's Eli Turner. I thank you for bringing her home. Clara nodded once. She didn't plan to stay. But something in Annie's smile made her linger a little longer than she meant. Clara had intended to leave the farm at dawn. She'd help Annie inside, fetched a basin of water for her to wash the dust from her hands and face, and given her a scrap of bread, but the thought of staying longer made her restless. She had a long road ahead, and Boone Kessel was still out there, relentless, with Silas Marlowe's wrath behind him. Yet as she watched Annie curl up on a faded quilt in the corner of the small room, clutching the bread like a talisman, Clara felt a tug in her chest she couldn't ignore. She couldn't leave the girl alone. Not here. Not now. Are you sure you're going to be all right? Clara asked softly. Annie looked up, eyes still glistening, cheeks flushed. You don't have to stay. I didn't know anyone would come. Clara's mouth tightened. The child's words, simple as they were, carried more weight than anything Boone's men could hurl at her. She swallowed. I'll stay. For a while. Just until things are safer. Eli Turner returned from the barn as she spoke. His clothes were dust-stained, hands rough with work, but his eyes were alert and calculating. He looked at Clara with caution, the kind of man reserved for strangers bearing both help and potential trouble. "You're the one who brought her home?" he asked. Yes, Clara said, keeping her tone even. She said you've been gone. I thought I could help. Eli studied her, then let out a long breath. I see that, and I appreciate it. Most folks would have ridden past. Come inside. Let's get some breakfast in you and the girl. Inside the small kitchen, the air smelled faintly of flour and smoke from the previous night's fire. Clara set the bread and water she carried on the table, then helped Annie wash her hands in a tin basin. The girl's small fingers worked stiffly in the cold water, and Clara noticed the dark circles under her eyes. 3 days alone in the open could break anyone, she thought, especially someone so small. While Annie ate, Clara explored the barn. Among the cluttered tools and stacked hay, she found a shotgun tucked behind a loose plank. The old metal was worn but functional. She checked the barrels, reloaded, and slung it across her back, a grim reminder that the world outside was as unforgiving as it had ever been. "Clara?" Annie's small voice called. She turned to find the girl, watching her from the doorway. "Yes." "Papa, he won't mind you staying a little, will he?" Annie asked, hope trembling in her voice. Clara knelt beside her. "I think he'll be grateful, but you have to promise to help me. Keep an eye out for trouble. Can you do that?" Annie nodded vigorously, crumbs spilling from her hand. "Yes." The rest of the morning passed with careful routines. Clara helped Eli mend a broken fence while Annie followed, mimicking each motion with serious attention. By mid-morning, Clara realized she was genuinely enjoying the work. The rhythm of hammer against wood, the smell of sun-warmed earth, the gentle breeze stirring the tall grass. For a moment, she almost forgot the hunt, the danger, the relentless pursuit. Almost, but it wasn't long before the threat made itself known. A distant thunder of hooves rattled the sparse valley, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of men in pursuit. Clara froze, listening, hand instinctively brushing over the shotgun. She could hear Boone Kessler's voice, barking orders that cut through the air like a whip. Eli stiffened beside her. "They found your trail," he muttered. Clara's mind raced. The farm was exposed, its fences barely a deterrent to men bent on taking her back. The livestock were loose enough to scatter, the buildings thin and weak. She felt the weight of responsibility settle heavy on her shoulders. Annie Mae was now tethered to her decisions, relying on her courage, her judgment. "We can't let them take her," Clara said firmly. "No," Eli agreed, eyes narrowing, "but we need a plan." For hours, they worked quietly, moving livestock into safer pens, reinforcing doors and gates, positioned themselves where they could observe the roads leading into the farm. Clara's hands ached, her back burned from lifting and bending, but she refused to slow. Every action was a small rebellion against the forces that sought to control her life. Every breath a declaration. She would not run from fear anymore. Night came with shadows stretching across the pastures, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and distant smoke from the horizon. Clara and Eli stood side by side, watching the last of the light fade. She could see the faint glimmer of metal. Boone's men circling the perimeter, assessing, waiting. "Think they'll attack?" Clara asked quietly. Eli shook his head, lips pressed tight. "They'll test us first. They always do, but they'll come if they think we're weak." Clara's hand rested on the shotgun. "Then we'll show them we're not." That night, as the wind stirred the tall grass and Annie slept in the small room near the fire, Clara patrolled the perimeter, listening to every sound. The stars above were sharp and bright, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of purpose settle firmly in her chest. She was no longer just fleeing. She was protecting. She was standing. By dawn, she had mapped the terrain in her mind, memorized every fence post, every shadow where someone might hide. And when Boone Kessler's men finally made their move, trying to drive off Eli's cattle under cover darkness, Clara was ready. Shots rang out, echoing across the valley. Clara fired from the barn loft, picking off the nearest of the intruders, forcing them to retreat. The rest scattered, caught between fear and disbelief. It wasn't a total victory. The farm had been tested, and so had she, but it was enough to prove that she would not run from this responsibility. Not for Annie, not for herself. As the first rays of morning lit the farm, Clara sat on the steps of the barn, shotgun across her lap, Daisy nuzzled her shoulder, tired but alive. Annie came running, her small arms around Clara's neck. And for the first time, Clara allowed herself a long, steady breath. She had taken a stand. She had stepped forward. And she knew, deep in her bones, that the fight was far from over. The next day, the threat made itself undeniable. The town of Dry Creek awoke under a pale, sharp sun, its streets lined with rough wooden buildings casting long, uneven shadows. Clara had been awake since first light, helping Eli feed the cattle and mend fences. She could feel the tension in the air like static before a storm. By mid-morning, the distant thunder of hooves reached her ears again, this time closer, unmistakable. Clara squinted toward the horizon and saw the figures emerging from the haze of dust. Boone Kessler and half a dozen men, mounted, broad-brimmed hats low, spurs glinting in the sun. Clara's stomach tightened. Boone had reached Dry Creek. The men were heading straight for the saloon, where townsfolk gathered, gossiping, drinking, and watching the world as it spun slowly past their little frontier town. Eli stood beside her on the small rise overlooking the farm. His hands rested on the fence, fingers white from gripping the wood. "They're going to stir the town against you," he said. "They'll make sure folks think you belong to Silas Marlowe." Clara swallowed. "They'll try to make it legal. They'll say he's owed everything," Eli finished grimly. "And some will believe it. Some won't. But Boone Kessler? He's the type to make them believe. Half the town already fears him, and the other half, they'll follow the crowd." Clara's thoughts went immediately to Annie Mae. The girl was too small, too trusting. If the town turned, or if Boone's men acted without discretion, Annie could be caught in the middle. "I won't let them touch her," Clara said, voice firm. Eli gave a slow nod. "Then we need a plan. First, we observe." They rode cautiously into the outskirts of Dry Creek, careful to stay hidden in shadows and behind buildings. The town streets were dusty, the boards of the sidewalks worn and uneven. Children played in small clumps, dogs barked, merchants shouted over the din of daily life. But the moment Boone entered the main street, everything changed. He dismounted with a swagger, rifle slung over his shoulder, and a cruel grin splitting his black-bearded face. The townsfolk paused, eyes wide, whispering to one another. Boone's men fanned out, leaning on fences, rifles casually resting in their hands, the sort of confidence born of lawless power. Clara watched from behind a corner, heart hammering. Boone strode into the saloon, where the afternoon crowd was thick with gamblers, cowhands, and the occasional shopkeeper. He slammed the door, the wooden panels rattling, and raised his voice. "This town has a duty," he bellowed. "A runaway bride of Silas Marlowe must be returned to her rightful place. By law, by the agreement, and anyone who shelters her will answer for it." The saloon murmured. Some men laughed nervously. Others shifted in unease. Clara noted the sheriff, a thin, nervous man with shifty eyes, standing near the door. He nodded subtly to Boone, signaling compliance. The corruption was plain as day. Clara's jaw tightened. It wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about survival, about truth. And the town, caught in fear and rumor, had become a weapon in Boone's hands. She slipped into the alley behind the saloon, mind racing. She needed proof, something to counter the lies, to show the town what was real. Letters, contracts, evidence of her uncle's dead arrangements. Anything that proved Marlowe had no legal claim over her. She remembered the small trunk in her wagon, the stack of papers she had carried with her out of Colorado. Eli arrived at her side, watching her carefully. "You think they'll believe you?" "They have to," Clara said, determination hardening her features. "Even if the sheriff won't help, the crowd will." Back at the farm, she had already prepared. Letters were sorted, notes organized. She had mapped the town and the saloon, memorized every escape route, every hiding place. Now, she would need to step into the public eye. Public truth was the only shield she had. By late afternoon, she was ready. She and Eli approached the town square, Annie hidden in the wagon under a blanket. Boone's men spotted them immediately and began to stir, bristling with unease. The saloon doors opened, and Boone emerged, rifle in hand, flanked by his cronies. His eyes caught Clara's immediately, narrowing. "So you've come out to play hero," he shouted. "The law is on my side, and the law will return what is mine." Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she held up the stack of papers, letting the sun catch the edges, and stepped onto the boardwalk. The murmuring crowd followed her every move. "These are the debts, the contracts, the arrangements," she said, voice loud and clear. "Every bit of this deal is illegal. My uncle had no right to sell me. Silas Marlowe has no legal claim. You can check for yourselves." Some of the crowd leaned closer, whispering to one another. A few turned their heads, ashamed at having been drawn in by Boone's threats. The sheriff's hand twitched near his sidearm, but he hesitated. He could feel the shift in sentiment. Boone's face twisted with rage. "You dare defy me in front of town?" Clara held her ground. "I don't need your permission to live free, and the people here won't let you take me without proof." The tension snapped like a wire. Boone's men bristled, but the crowd murmured, voices rising confusion and outrage. Even the corrupt sheriff realized the law could not justify a crime done openly before witnesses. Boone realized, too, that he no longer had the advantage. With a curse, he swung into the saddle. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You've only delayed the reckoning." And with that, he and his men rode hard out of town, dust trailing behind them like a warning. Clara exhaled, heart hammering. She felt Eli's hand on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. She nodded, still wary. "For now. But they'll be back. They always come back." As the town returned to its slow rhythm, Clara understood something she hadn't before. The fight wasn't just for herself. It was for Annie, for truth, and for the small flicker of justice in a land ruled by fear and gunpowder. And she would stand. Weeks of careful preparation had brought them to this moment. The farm had been reinforced, the town watched, and Clara had amassed every piece of evidence she could find. Letters, debt notes, contracts, all proving Silas Marlowe's claim over her was fraudulent. Boone Kessler's threats had grown sharper, his men more desperate, and the townsfolk of Dry Creek were now quietly taking sides, whispers spreading through the dusty streets like wildfire. The day of confrontation dawned bright and sharp, the sun burning through the morning haze. Clara and Eli approached the old barn near the edge of town, the place that had become the gathering point for those willing to listen to reason. Half the townsfolk were already present, their faces wary, their hands restless, some gripping tools as if ready to defend themselves from whatever chaos Boone might bring. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her chin high. She had rehearsed her words, counted her steps, and visualized every detail. Boone Kessler, sure of his intimidation, would not have expected her to be ready. Inside the barn, the smell of hay and dust mixed with sweat and apprehension. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the wooden slats, casting long stripes across the floor. The boards creaked underfoot as people shuffled closer, murmuring quietly. Clara stood at the center, Eli to her right, Annie peeking from behind the wagon. The door slammed open. Boone Kessler strode in, spur boots clattering, black beard bristling, his rifle resting casually on his shoulder. His eyes swept the crowd, then fixed on Clara. "So, the little bride shows her face," he sneered. "I see the town as misled by lies." Clara's gaze did not waver. "No lies," she said, voice steady. "What you call truth is just fear and intimidation. These papers prove it. The deal with my uncle was illegal. Silas Marlowe has no claim over me, and you, Boone Kessler, have no authority here." The crowd shifted. Some whispered, some gasped. A few stepped closer to get a better look at the documents Clara held in her hand. Boone's eyes flicked to the papers. His grin faltered. "Show me," he demanded. Clara held them high, letting the sunlight catch the edges, casting faint glimmers across the barn floor. She handed copies to a few townsfolk she trusted, men and women whose word carried weight in Dry Creek. The sheriff, standing awkwardly at the back, hesitated. He could see the shift in sentiment. People were beginning to question their loyalty, to see Boone's bravado for what it was, empty threat. "You see," Clara said, stepping forward, "my uncle had no right to sell me. Silas Marlowe cannot claim me, and the law, if it is applied fairly, supports me. Boone Kessler has only his gun and his men. Nothing more. Boone's face hardened. You think you've won? That these fools will protect you? They already have, Eli said firmly, stepping beside Clara. His presence radiated calm authority. And if they haven't, they will not stand idle while you terrorize this town. The tension in the barn was electric, every eye on Boone and Clara, every hand twitching with anticipation. The sun rose higher, light streaking across the dust-filled air, illuminating every expression. Fear, curiosity, defiance. Boone's men shifted nervously. They were used to control, to fear guiding obedience. But now the crowd was watching, and even the most loyal of them hesitated. One young man lowered his rifle slightly, glancing at the murmuring townsfolk. You cannot defy me. Boone roared. I am law in this territory. No, Clara said, stepping closer. Her voice carried over the murmurs. Law is justice, and justice will not hide behind a gun. She began reading portions of the contract aloud, detailing every illegal clause, every forged signature, every debt that Silas Marlowe had attempted to leverage against her. The townsfolk listened, some nodding, some murmuring among themselves, voices rising in disbelief and anger. Boone's fury grew, his hand twitching toward his rifle. But the eyes around him, the collective scrutiny of the town, held him back. Even the corrupt sheriff swallowed hard, realizing that any violent action would turn the tide irrevocably against him. Finally, Boone's shoulders slumped slightly. He had underestimated Clara's preparation, underestimated the strength she drew from truth and support. With a curse, he spun on his heel and strode toward the doors, his men reluctantly following. This isn't over, he shouted as he exited, dust and straw scattering behind him. You'll pay for this, Hayes. But Clara did not flinch. The barn door swung closed behind him, leaving a tense silence in its wake. The townsfolk began to murmur among themselves, voices cautious but shifting from fear to curiosity, from doubt to admiration. A few came forward, shaking Clara's hand, nodding in respect. Eli placed a hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. You stood your ground. Clara glanced at Annie, who was peeking from the wagon, eyes wide with awe. The girl's small hand reached for hers, gripping tightly. We did it, Clara said, finally allowing a small, genuine smile to cross her face. Together, the barn, once a place of tension and anticipation, now hummed with the quiet satisfaction of victory. Clara knew Boone would return. That danger never truly disappeared in the West. But for the first time, she felt that she had control over her fate, that she could protect those she cared for. As the sun continued to climb, casting warm light across the barn and fields beyond, Clara felt a strange, unfamiliar calm settle in her chest. She had faced fear, defied injustice, and emerged unbroken. And for the first time in months, she believed she could finally breathe without constantly looking over her shoulder. Weeks passed, each one settling over the farm like the slow turning of seasons. The dust of conflict had begun to settle, and the landscape, once tense with the threat of Boone Kessler and Silas Marlowe, slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Clara rose each morning to the soft calls of the livestock, the low rustle of wheat, and the distant bark of dogs, reminders that life could continue despite the violence that lingered like a shadow in memory. The farm itself seemed to breathe with renewal. Fences were repaired sturdily, gates realigned, and hay stacked neatly in the barn loft. Fields that had lain fallow for months were sown with corn and beans, small shoots poking to the soil like stubborn fingers of green hope. Clara found herself working alongside Eli, her hands learning the rhythm of planting, hoeing, and mending. Each task, repetitive and grounding, became a balm for the fear that had haunted her nights. Annie Mae thrived in this new life. The child's energy returned, cheeks flushed with sun, eyes bright with curiosity. She followed Clara from task to task, learning the ways of the farm, how to milk a cow without spilling, how to braid hay for the animals, and even how to knead cornbread dough under Clara's watchful eyes. Laughter filled the small kitchen as Annie impatiently rolled dough with tiny hands, flour dusting the table and her hair in soft clouds. Clara found herself smiling often, sometimes without realizing it, the first genuine warmth she had felt in years. Eli Turner's role shifted as well. Where once he'd been cautious, wary of strangers and the dangers of the world beyond his farm, he now moved with a calm confidence. Clara had proved herself more than capable, and he relied on her judgment and courage. Together, they monitored the perimeter, maintained the livestock, and ensured the farm's safety, the sense of partnership quietly growing between them. The town of Dry Creek remained a shadow in the background, a place that had once held threats and intimidation, but now seemed distant and muted. Boone Kessler had not returned, and though Clara knew he still prowled the edges of their lives, the balance of power had shifted. The townsfolk, having witnessed Clara's courage and the undeniable proof of her autonomy, no longer feared to support her quietly when necessary. The sheriff, though still cautious, dared not interfere, leaving the farm in peace. Clara's own sense of self, once fragile and tethered to fear, had grown resilient. The experience of standing against Boone and Silas, of protecting Annie and herself, had awakened a new strength within her. She no longer viewed the world as a place to flee from, but as a terrain she could navigate with skill, courage, and careful planning. Each day on the farm became a lesson in patience, endurance, and quiet power. One evening, as the sky burned with the orange glow of sunset, Clara sat on the steps of the barn, her hands resting on her knees. The shotgun leaned against a wooden post nearby. Daisy, her faithful mule, nuzzled her gently, and Annie Mae sat beside her, flour-dusted hands clasped together. The air was warm, carrying the smell of earth and the faint smoke of a distant chimney. Annie leaned her small head against Clara's shoulder. "Do you think Boone will ever come back?" she asked, voice soft, tinged with lingering fear. Clara considered the horizon, where hills and prairies stretched endlessly. "Perhaps," she said, "but we are ready if he does. And even if he comes, he will not find us unprepared. We know how to stand." Annie's hand reached for Clara's, squeezing tightly. "I'm glad you stayed," she whispered. Clara felt a surge of warmth, an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to fully experience in years. The feeling of being needed, of belonging. "I'm glad to," she replied, voice gentle but firm. "You're my family now, and I'm not leaving." The sky deepened into twilight, stars appearing like scattered diamonds over the prairie. The wind stirred the wheat, carrying whispers of the past and the soft promise of the future. Clara leaned back, let her eyes close for a moment, allowing herself to breathe fully without the constant weight of fear. She could feel the farm's pulse, steady and reassuring, and the quiet determination of life continuing despite all the hardships endured. Days blended into weeks. Harvest preparations began, animals were tended, and Clara continued to teach Annie the small joys of farm life. Sewing, baking, reading letters from distant relatives, and even recounting tales of adventure from the road. Each lesson built confidence, trust, and a deep bond that surpassed the mere circumstance of rescue. Clara had become protector, a teacher, and, above all, a family to the girl who had once waited alone by the windmill. Eli, observing the bond between Clara and Annie, no longer asked how long she would stay. It was clear that her presence had become permanent, an integral part of the farm's renewed life. The trio functioned as a quiet unit, bound not by law or obligation, but by mutual respect, care, and shared experience. One warm evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Annie Mae hugged Clara tightly. "Now I have a sister," she whispered, the words filled with wonder and relief. Clara's throat tightened. For a long moment, she could not speak. The past year, filled with fear, running, and uncertainty, seemed to collapse into that single, profound statement. She looked at the small, trusting face pressed against her chest, felt the strength and innocence it carried, and allowed herself to smile. For the first time in years, she smiled without fear. The stars emerged fully now, scattering light across the darkened farm. The barn stood solid, the fences taut, and the fields stretched out in quiet abundance. Life had reclaimed its rhythm, and Clara, once a shadow fleeing the chains of obligation and fear, now stood firmly in her place, not just surviving but thriving. The world beyond the farm remained uncertain, wild, and untamed, as it always would be in the West. Yet Clara no longer felt powerless before it. She had fought, protected, and endured, and she had found home, family, and purpose where she least expected it. Eli watched from the porch, Annie asleep nearby. Clara attended the evening chores and allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The farm was safe, the trio bonded, and for now, at least, the shadows of the past were held at bay by courage, truth, and the simple, enduring power of choice. Clara's eyes lingered on the horizon, the wind tousling her hair. She knew challenges might come again, but she also knew that together they could face anything. And in that quiet, warm evening, with Annie's small hand in hers and the land stretching endlessly ahead, Clara allowed herself to hope. The prairie whispered softly in the twilight. Freedom, safety, and belonging all finally within her reach. And as she breathed in the scent of earth and life, Clara Hayes understood that, at last, she had found the place where she belonged.